Welcome guys to another episode of the Rize. Now on today's one, I'm going to be covering how long to give yourself for a prep. And not just that, but the things that you need to consider when putting together your prep timeline, and also things you need to do before a prep to basically make that time frame run as smooth as possible. So I'm going to break this video down into 3 sections. First one, how long to prep for. Second, things you need to consider before you go into that prep process. And third, how much time do you need to get the job done? So going straight in for the first one, how long to give yourself a prep, it's going to depend on a few different factors. And the way that I always like to almost assess a client in terms of looking for a tick box of things I'm looking for when planning their prep, it's going to come down to a few subsections. And the first one is going to be your dieting experience. So how many times have you dieted and how often are you used to going through that process? And the reason that's relevant to your time frame is because if, for instance, for you to go through a successful diet, you're going to need to, let's say, macro track, swap things in and out, potentially include the odd off plan here and there. Your time frame for prep should always be a little bit longer. If you're somebody that can dial in for a prep, not need anything off plan and be militantly adherent to that plan, you're probably going to need less time in the prep. So that's something to consider first of all when you're looking at your time frame is what's your dieting experience like? And be honest with yourself. There's no point trying to say to yourself, I'm going to not come off plan a single point during that prep and then almost be a couple of weeks behind if you have had a couple of off plans in that time period. So really assessing your dieting experience as a client and saying to yourself, how religious can I commit to that plan? If it's 100%, you're probably not going to need as long as you think. If experience isn't all there yet, then give yourself a little bit more time as a little bit of wiggle room for that prep. So dieting experience is the first thing to consider when looking at your time frame. And if you have a coach as well, be honest with them about that process. Something I'll always talk to clients about before we prep is where do they feel like their mental discipline is with food before we go into that prep process. Because if you try and set yourself an unrealistic time frame and say to yourself, I'm not going to have anything off plan, and then you end up having a bit off plan, you're then going to have to play catch up and potentially push that prep harder than you need to as you go through that process. The next point is going to be your starting composition. And the reason that this is important is if you've got, let's say, 50 pounds to come off to be in stage ready condition, that's going to look very different in a time frame standpoint compared to a 20-pound prep. So assessing your starting point or having your coach assess your starting point is a crucial element in being able to put together that time frame in knowing exactly how long to give yourself. Now, something that's useful and mindful is working with a coach long enough so that you can plan the stages prior to a prep before you map out that time frame. So let's say, for instance, you go through a pre-prep diet or one push-up before you start your prep. You can plan them phases in mind of the prep that's coming to make sure your starting point's in the best position possible. If you're just starting with a coach and the first thing you do is go into a prep, you need to consider the starting point that you're going to that coach with for the time frame that you're then going to get to prep. So composition and starting composition for that prep is going to determine how long you need to take off that body fat in the most productive way possible to present your best look. Because again, how much body weight you have to come off is going to some degree affect that look if you have got to pull off, let's say 2 to 3 pounds every single week to meet that conditioning goal that you need to be in shape. The next point to consider is the time of year you're looking to prep. I always speak to clients about how their year's looking before mapping in the prep. Because let's say, for instance, you've got a holiday booked or you've got an occasion that you can't get out of. Looking at these occasions and planning them into a time frame is super important to make sure that you can just keep yourself locked in for that period of time. If you've got holidays, weeks away, all within a time frame of prep, it's just going to make that occasion it's going to make that prep harder to adhere to if you've got different occasions and different things coming up within that time frame. So looking at your year as a whole and saying, okay, what shows do I want to do and when's the best time for me to prep logically to make sure I can be as on it with a plan as possible. And the last one is going to be supplements. If you're somebody that uses PEDs, you need to plan that into your time frame to make sure you know how long you're going to be on cycle for, at what point you're going to get blood work done, and ultimately that duration of exposure is important when planning your prep to make sure you're not on for too long and you can be strategic when planning your cycle and supplement use to assist you in that prep time frame rather than potentially running health risks by planning that prep for too long or not being sensible with the phases prior to then starting your cycle when you start prep. So all them factors there are so key in the time frame that you need to prep. So again, just to summarize them as a whole, first one's going to be your starting condition. Whatever shape you're in is going to make a difference to how long you need for that prep. Let's say you've got 20 pounds to pull off. That may look like, as a rough example, a 12-week prep. If you've got 40 to 50 pounds to come off, you're going to want to give yourself 20 to 22 weeks in that prep to make sure you can get the job done. And something I always, as a side note, mention to my clients is the time frame for prep doesn't necessarily matter in terms of the duration of it. Like some people get scared when they see 20 to 25 week prep. As long as that prep's being managed, it's not as if you're going to be in a complete deficit the whole of that 20 weeks. There'll be times for deloads, potential refeeds if you need it. So the time frame that you diet for doesn't necessarily matter if the prep's being managed right and you've got weeks planned in there for deloads, resets and things like that. So don't let the length of the prep overwhelm you. Next point was dieting experience. Make sure you've got the experience prior to prepping to make sure you can have the most on-it prep possible. One, to fuel your confidence and know that you can do that process. And second, make sure that you can do the prep from a logical standpoint in what's going to be the best for results, rather than needing to try and force yourself to do that prep and adhere to a diet that you potentially aren't ready for yet. And last but not least, supplement use, planning that into your time frame to make sure you've got enough wiggle room in there to work in your cycles, health phases before and during prep. Now, next thing to move on to is things you need or should consider prior to a prep. Now, something I'm always planning for all my clients is what's called a pre-prep phase. And the reason for this pre-prep phase is to make sure that we're starting into a deficit at the best physiological set point, meaning there's no fatigue from a previous training block. We've got off plans out of our system maybe. We're mentally ready to go into that prep. And also at the same time, something I get a lot of my clients to do is undertake like some pre-prep homework in terms of like the values that they want to stick to, the way that they want to go through their prep, and also the person that they want to become through that prep as well. So there's a multiple list of things that you can do prior to a prep to basically make sure, one, it runs as smooth as possible, and second, you enjoy that prep process as much as you can whilst going to the extremes of getting in condition. So diving into these points a little bit more, as I say, the first one's going to be a deload, devolume, or complete rest. Now, different coaches will have different ways of doing this, but ultimately it's what suits you best. I always say to clients, I'm not going to force you to take a full week off the gym if you're going to be at home not doing anything, wishing you was in the gym, and you're just going to go balls to the wall then as soon as you get back to training. So again, decide what one suits you best, and I think it falls within 3 categories. You either do a full week off the gym, you either do a devolume, which is where you go in and do like 50% of your sessions, or you do 3 or 4 sessions that week and take the back end of the week off rest. So there's 3 different ways there that you can ensure you're starting the prep in the best physical place possible to give that 100% from a training standpoint and get the best response from a body fat response as well. Next thing to consider prior to going into a prep is also going to be a mental reset. Like prep is a tough process. So making sure you give yourself that time mentally to be prepared and ready is so important. If you've just come off the back of a real intense off season, you're probably going to be sick of food, a little bit tired, and even though subconsciously you might be motivated for prep, you need to make sure you give yourself that time prior to mentally be ready to prep so that you can go all in and give it 100% energy from start to finish. And mental resets can come in any way, shape or form which suits you best, whether that's going on a holiday, having a couple of off plans with people that you may not see during prep, or just little things like that, giving time to other relationships and things so that you can be mentally in a place to be selfish towards your prep to give it 100%. So make sure you're mentally ready to go into the prep as much as you are physically. Next point to that is going to be checking finances. Make sure you've got all your supplements ordered before you go into prep. The last thing that you want to do is, let's say, start a cycle or start a run of supplements and then not being able to uphold them for the duration of the prep. So make sure you've calculated and planned in advance. Have I got enough finances to get myself the whole way through the prep, whether that's supplements, food bills, all things like that you need to consider before going into the prep. Next one is going to be checking shows and locations. Don't start your prep without knowing what shows you're doing. I'm not saying you need to know exactly what show you're doing on what date, but have a rough timeline in place to know, okay, I'm aiming for this date. So again, you can consider all the things that we spoke about before and also know roughly what you're aiming for in terms of like that date so you can fit it into the calendar. Next category to cover, as I say, is going to be kind of federations and categories. So this is something where a coach's opinion will be really valuable to you in deciding, okay, what category suits me best? What category shall I enter? Which is super important, especially if you're doing federations like NPC, which are going to have multiple classes that you can enter. Because I've seen it with clients before where they've entered a novice or true novice class, not entered the open, but been competitive enough to hang in the open classes. And that's through the coach not potentially knowing or the client not knowing. So making sure you check the categories that you're going to enter and as many of them as you're going to do to make sure you fit that criteria before booking and planning them shows. So make sure that you've planned the categories that you're doing, the federations that you're competing with, and giving yourself enough time to understand kind of like the posing which goes for that federation, as they can all be different as well. So making sure that you've got all of this planned out prior to starting the prep is then going to lead to you going into the prep with the most like relaxed mindset, knowing exactly what you're doing, categories that you're competing in, posing that you need to learn, and just having that set date and countdown in mind as well. And to tag a question on the back of this, one that I always get is, shall I do a long prep? Shall I do a short prep? And a lot of this comes down to like your mentality as a person. Again, there comes the right way to do things, but then there's also the right ways to do things for you. So I've had it before where clients are like, they're locked in for 12 to 14 weeks and they're ready to do as much cardio needed. They're ready to diet for 12 to 14 weeks with anything off plan. And giving that particular client a long prep wouldn't work well, as they're not going to be locked in for that 20 to 24 week period. So some clients, and this may be yourself, if you've got that mindset where you're willing to go all in and you can sacrifice everything for 12 weeks, potentially a shorter prep may suit you better as a person. Whereas if you're somebody that's quite stoic and you don't mind doing a longer prep knowing that that long-term outcome is going to play in your favor, a longer prep may suit you best. So there's not necessarily a set rule of thumb with which one you should choose. It all comes down to physically what suits your body best and mentally what you're ready to go all in for that time period. Another way you can decide how long to plan your prep for is looking at or calculating a rough rate of loss. If you ask somebody with experience in coaching roughly how much body weight you've got to take off, and I say roughly because it's never for certain, you can roughly then calculate your rate of loss into your time frame of prep. So you've got 20 weeks to prep and 20 pounds to come off. You roughly want your net loss per week to be £1. So calculating how much you need to lose over that prep can also be a good, very logical way to do your prep, but just making sure you're going to be ready in time. Natural or assisted preps. Now, there's not going to be too much difference between the two, although what I will say is from an enhanced standpoint, you may be able to yield a greater rate of loss through using fat loss supplements than being a natural athlete. So this is something that you should consider in your time frame, in that if an assisted person can take off 20 pounds in 12 weeks, they're not necessarily going to feel that fatigue the same way somebody that's natural would if they've got 20 pounds to take off over a longer time period. As being natural, you haven't got the tools in place to be able to ensure that muscle retention is certain. So that's something that you need to manage through your rate of loss in your training. So potentially as a natural athlete, planning longer so you can make sure the calorie reductions are smaller and you're able to hold on to training performance for longer is always the way that as a coach I'll plan my clients' prep, whether they're assisted or natural. So again, considering the fact that assisted athletes are going to have hormones in place to make sure that their training isn't going to take so much of a dip compared to if you're natural. So that then will go into the consideration of a time frame. So as a summary, guys, there's multiple things to consider here in planning your first prep. One being obviously the total duration of the prep. Second being your starting set point. Third being supplement use and the shows you got booked in. So I hope this video has been insightful for anybody wondering how long you should prep for and things you need to consider prior to going into a prep. As it's not something where you say, I'm going to give myself this long and just go for it. Be strategic with it, plan it out, and make sure that you can give yourself the best prep possible by planning in advance and making sure you've got all your variables and markers set to do that prep as successfully as possible. Now, something I want to add on to the back of the video, if anybody's got any questions regarding this or wants me to personally map them out a prep timeline, drop me a DM on Insta and send me over some stats in terms of your starting point, and I'll send you over a free roadmap on how to break down your prep or how long to give yourself specifically for the shows that you're aiming for. Thanks for watching, guys.